Quickly, over to you, Emmett.
Thank you, Trudy. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to yet another technical drop-in session hosted by Veritas. It's a lovely morning here in Melbourne. I'm glad you are all having a good week. Today we are going to have our session very similar to how we've been doing in the last few months. We have our technical specialists here with us. We've got the layout very similar. We will start with a 25-minute presentation where we'll talk about data insight today and how data insight can help you manage and minimize your risks. We have Patrick Fisher and Ranga and Rob from the Veritas Data Insight team. We will have the presentation run by Pat, and then we'll have a demo run by Ranga. Rob and I will help facilitate the questions. Now, as we've been doing in the last few sessions, there is a JB Hi-Fi $50 voucher for the best question asked. So make sure you put in all the questions that you have in the Q&A window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can during today. But if we are not able to get to the questions today, we will make sure that we get back to you when we respond with our slide deck. Effectively, this is your forum to ask the right people within the Veritas architects and get as much information as possible from this topic. Now, we'll look at the same presentation as well as make sure that if you have questions, don't wait till the end. Please type in your questions in the Q&A window, and we'll make sure we answer it. There will be points where we will touch base and discuss some interesting questions as we go along. But overall, we will have a 30-minute, maybe 45 minutes of demonstration going through the product. Now, with that said, I don't want to spend too much time on the introduction. I will hand it over to Pat to take it from here. Over to you, Pat.
Thanks, Emmett. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this tech drop-in. Today we're going to be talking about using data insights to reduce risk. Now, we've got three common data types, or three common data structures, right? We've got structured data, semi-structured data, and unstructured data. So structured data, which is considered the most traditional of data storage, it is stored and formatted in a predefined data models with relationships between its rows and columns. And it's used for effective analysis. Now, the type of data that we typically see are databases, and common examples are structured data is your relational databases such as SQL databases, e.g. MS SQL, Oracle. Next, we come to semi-structured data. Semi-structured data is information that does not reside in a relational database or other forms of data tables, but does have some organization properties that make it easier to analyze. One example is email messages, excluding its content that sits in a messaging platform, let's say Microsoft Exchange, Exchange Online. Lastly, we've got unstructured data. Unstructured data is data that is not organized in a predefined manner and does not have a predefined data model. Right? Example, your typical Office documents, PDFs, text, media logs. This data is usually stored in a multitude of locations, such as your Windows file servers, NAS shares, cloud storage. Now, we find that structured and semi-structured data is easy to manage and secure. However, unstructured data is more challenging, and it's your typical target for attack, such as ransomware. So, Veritas has performed significant research in the form of our Data Genomics Index and the Global Databird Report. And what we found is, we've got three key findings. One is data keeps on growing at an impressive rate. There's a lot of data stored that hasn't been touched in a long time. And organizations don't know the context around the data they're storing. So from the analysis that we performed, we found that 15% of data is clean and used on a regular basis. And then 33% of that data is redundant, obsolete, and trivial. And that's the information that we download, we use it once, and then we just leave it and forget about it. And then, of course, lastly is dark data, which makes up 52%. And dark data is data that we haven't touched in a very long time, and we don't know what it is, and we don't know what its value. Then, if we look at the data genomics index, we find that data growth averages around 39% year on year. And from that analysis that we performed, 41% of the environment has not been modified in the past 3 years, with 12% of data being ancient that hasn't been modified in the last 7 years, right? So the industry has kind of built a situation where we're hoarding data. So how can we use the insights of our data to mitigate risk? Right. So at Veritas, we can help you with one, manage your unstructured data and gain control and an understanding of your data and the securities that are applied for on that data. Two, we can help you classify your data to understand what information is stored. For example, documents that contain personally identifiable information, and help you achieve compliance around that information. And then third is helping you monitor your data and gain visibility on access events of data, who's accessing your data, when, where, and help you monitor it and help you monitor around attacks such as ransomware. Give you the ability that something's happening, we can identify that. So how can we help you reduce risk and exposure? I'd like to introduce Veritas Data Insight. Veritas Data Insight helps organizations solve problems of identifying your data owners, the responsible parties for that information, in spite of incomplete or inaccurate metadata or tracking information. And it can help administrators by providing visibility into the data owners and how the data is being used, which ultimately provides support for data management practices that are employed within your organization. Data Insight's reporting analytics and visualization capabilities allows your users and administrators to determine the value of that data that's stored on your file systems. And some data may contain information that is important for compliance purposes, while at the same time maintaining security. At that same time, administrators can begin identifying who has access to that data and determine who has the appropriate access rights to that data and keeping the security of the data intact. So how can we use Data Insight? Well, one, we can help you improve your data management. We can help you reduce risk by uncovering the unknown. We can optimize your total cost of ownership on your file systems by allowing action to be performed, for example, deleting data that you don't want or need. We can help you achieve compliance and classify that data. So one is managing the custodians or the owners of the data to ensure that we engage in compliance. We can automate data access reviews, so being able to identify who has access to what data, what shares, and ensuring that the right people have access. Adhere to your data retention guidelines, ensuring that we're keeping the right data for the right amount of time, and allow you to classify to meet any regulatory obligations. Lastly, we can use Data Insight to monitor and protect your data from any security risks. So one is find the data that is at the greatest risk of exposure and lock it down. And then also provide you that audit of historical access, monitor data usage of sensitive information, and ensuring that the right people have access to that right data. And with the three, you can use that to then ultimately mitigate any risks on your file systems. So I want to introduce the Veritas Information Classifier. It's an intelligent and powerful classification solution that is used across a number of our solutions. What it can allow you to do is classify your data on proximity searching, You can, based on keywords, check some validation. You can use regular expressions to classify data, use confidence-based dispositions, and even like a min and max count. So, for example, I'm looking for credit card information that could be stored on my file system. So, with our information classifier, we've got built-in policies that will identify credit card information that's stored in Excel spreadsheets and, for example, Word documents. With Data Insight, we can also help detect a ransomware attack. So within the solution, we've got built-in templates to detect anomalies such as write or rename of files, in any activity on renaming of extensions, renaming of parent folders, detecting activity by the creation of files and extensions. We've got a list of file patterns, and we regularly update that. Whenever there's a new ransomware attack, we're continuously updating Data Insight to detect those patterns. We also have the ability to trace malicious executables, right, and detect the ransomware by known file extensions. So Data Insight is one of the solutions that not only allows you to manage your data, achieve compliance, but also secure it and detect it yourself from ransomware and mitigating those risks. So I'm going to hand over to Ranga, but to do a demo. But before that, I want to ask Amit and Rob if you have any questions.
So Pat, there are no questions as yet. But if I look at the high level discussion that we've had on the slide, are we looking at a multi-fold construct here where you have your unstructured data hosted in your environment, and then what Data Insight provides you is a layer or a multi-layer approach where the first layer actually looks at who owns the data, who has created the content, who has the level of visibility on that content. The second layer, which is on top of it, or probably a second perspective, is once I know the ownership, we then look at access patterns. Now, A, I know where my ownership is. B, I also want to know, given the ownership, who is accessing what part of the information. Now, with that correlated together, you can actually flag out the right or inappropriate access for your data, as well as a sudden change in the pattern can give you a view of a vulnerability or a ransomware kind of a behavior that particular user access has not been there for a very long time, but suddenly in this month we are seeing a lot of activity there. So the user ownership, user access together can give you a risk profile. That risk profile is what we want to bring to light. And because with the risk profile, we are also talking about dark data. I think the iceberg that you showed clearly calls out that there is information beyond 50%, which does not really belong to the live content. It has been archived, it has been sitting there for years, and not many people know about it. Now, I think if we look at all these three factors coming together, it becomes a vulnerability or a weak point within our data set where attackers can really get into such kind of information or such kind of data which is not being accessed, which has inappropriate access privileges, and then it just goes undetected if people start tampering or corrupting it. Is that a good summary of what we've just identified?
Exactly. You got it down to the point. And the fact is, to the point is that dark data. Now, there could be information that could pose a risk to your organization, right? And not knowing that and not having visibility of those access patterns, this is where a lot of organizations have gotten into trouble when they've been hit by ransomware. They don't know who accessed it or how those access vectors were and what data was taken. And this is what Data Insight can provide is, as you mentioned, Amit, what your data is, who has access, your access patterns, and then together you can then use that information to mitigate your risks.
Brilliant. And I think there is a question on a very similar line pattern, Ranga. The question is around, we still, if you look at ransomware and detecting a ransomware is a good start, but and it's a brilliant cue to the demo as well. But if you look at detection being one part, alerting and notifying that the ransomware has come in and help you reduce the damage that it can cause if it is let run for a longer duration is the key. So how does Data Insight help in this regard? And maybe Ranga, when we are getting into the demo, if you could just spend a little bit of time in terms of the options we have in alerting and notifications, and how those can integrate with any managers or event managers in the organization. That could be a good cue. All right, I didn't want to derail the demo. Let's get into the demo straight up. Uh, Rob, any other questions that have come in? I've looked at the latest Q&A.
Yeah, look, that's probably the main one there. I mean, I think we've got another small one. We've got another one in there around what type of data, can this data be output to a database or a CSV kind of file? And the answer is yes, we can output that data out, and I'll just I'll type that up quickly.
Brilliant. Sounds good. All right, over to you, Ranga.
Thanks, Amit. Thanks, Pat. All right, so let's go through the demo. Before I start sharing my screen, so I'm sure my bandwidth won't be able to cope up, so I'll switch off the video until I do the demo, and I'll come back on air once we have questions. I have a bit of issue sharing it. Okay. All right. Hopefully you're able to see my screen.
Yes, we can.
All right, lovely. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Data Insight demo session. So you've already heard in a nutshell what Data Insight can do and what is it about. Now, once you're logged into Data Insight, you will be presented with a management console. So it's all a web-based console. Now, this Data Insight management console consists of multiple aspects to it. So there is a header part there that you see, and then there are other reference parts there or task options that you would see under the navigation pane. So typically, we always get into something called as a dashboard screen. So that's the click there. So once you click on the dashboard, you'll see an overview of your environment. So what data sources that you are scanning or scheduled for scanning, how many shares have been scanned across it, a plethora of information that you get. So you get to see a whole lot of this. And I'll show more as we go through all the users, what are on the watch list, alerts that are generated. So there was one question around alerts. So you would see alert-related information. On top of it, you would see policy-related conditions that you can set, many inbuilt out-of-box reports there, what are the workflows that you can build, and finally, settings. Now, although I'm not going in detail about each one of those, so definitely we can show each of these capabilities as a broader demo when you engage with us. I can give you a better perspective, a longer duration. So I just wanted to cover some 4 use cases here, apart from answering certain questions there. So the 4 use cases being that, one, in the organizations today, the storage footprint is too large, and you don't know what you don't know. So how do you understand the storage footprint in your organization? So what files are relatively new to my environment? What files are changing? What files are active? Who is not using it? Which user is inactive? Which folder is inactive? Where are these files? What's the size of these files? So you would want to know this. You would want to get a view of this and take actions on that. So that's the first use case that I'll be talking about, followed by the risk exposure. So Amit, in one of the reference points, he said that, oh, what's the risk here? Where am I being at risk? So is it the users who are creating the risk? Is it the permissions that are adding to the risk? Is it the activity that is adding to the risk? So where is this risk? So show that increased risk, your position there. What's the risk exposure there? Then third use case that I would want to talk about is, what is compliance? Are you compliant? Is your organization compliant? So what is the effect of falling out of compliance? What's the value that you're bringing? And what's the value at stake if you are non-compliant? So that's the other aspect that I'm speaking. And finally, how do we, what actions we can take? So how do we archive the data, or what else can we do with this functionality? All right, so as I said, big picture, that's the console that you see, and the settings. So settings is the key here. So you can bring in, ideally we support many different filers there. So apart from the health and monitoring, so this is where you would see all the data insight servers, the different types of filers that you can add. You can add them in bulk, or you can add them there, or you can add your cloud sources there and so on. So your OneDrives or boxes and so on. So this is where you add all your information. There's some remediation actions that you would want to take. For instance, you would want to archive certain type of data if it matches certain criteria. So what are the policies around this and so on? Then there's classification options. So how do you want to work with compliance or regulatory requirements? So how can you do that? And then your alert settings or global settings that you would want to do. So those settings can be configured there. All right, so going into the workspace, as I said, this is the dashboard view that you would see. And so what's nice about the screen is it illustrates the context of what we are looking for. So what we are monitoring, what are we scanning, how many folders are we scanning. So it gives a big number there, what are the data sources that we are scanning and so on. All right, now let's get into an activity lookup here. So what I'll do is I'll go into data sources. So these are the data sources that I've been adding, that I've added there. I can do it that way, or I can also go that way and look at the information and then start looking for data. So there are these particular folders that are getting scanned. Now straight away it is showing that some information about what I've selected. So from a medical perspective, so there is some amount of data, there are these files, and you see some activities there and so on. Now, I can expand this profile to see that there's a lot more information that I can look for. I can look for user activity. I can look for folder activity. Now, you see that for this particular folder, there is so much of activity in October, but I can also look from a subfolder or file perspective, what is the activity there, and what are the inactive folders. So this is where that is causing my first use case. My storage footprint is too large. Why? Because this is what is contributing. It's inactive files and folders. Nobody has touched this folder. So there could be an owner in the organization who is owning this, but that person might not have any visibility of this, who's using it. So people are dumping data. You have Game of Thrones season 8 coming in there, and this owner doesn't even know what is there, and your important piece of storage, very high value storage, is being used for non-business, non-conformance requirements. So how can you get rid of this? So this gives you a direct overview of your storage footprint. So non-conformance related folders or inactive subfolders that I can say. Now, for instance, I'll go to something called as group share or home folders, you can think like. Now, there is a very large number there. So that's the number of files. So by default, it is looking at last 6 months. Now, maybe I can look for the last year. So what's the activity or inactivity in the last year? Now, I can see that there are many subfolders there that is amounting to that number which hasn't been touched in the last year, wastage of space, right? So that's one way to look at it. Now, what you can also do is you can go back to your dashboard view. Now, here it is showing from a security perspective. Now I can look from a storage perspective, just to give you an overview about how each of these shares are working against the storage, which one is consuming the large storage. At any given point in time, you can export this information as a CSV file and then maybe aggregate it to a centralized portal where somebody from auditing or somebody from a team is looking at it from a conformance perspective, and then, okay, they can take certain actions here, right? So that's from a storage. So how can you increase your storage, and how can you make sure that your existing storage is used for better purposes, for more active files and folders rather than stale and inactive files. All right, so the next one is increased risk exposure. So what is risk?
Just to
yeah, go ahead.
Before you move on from the content sources, if at all we have cloud content sources like the OneDrives or the Box, the view that we are seeing here in terms of the users as well as the consumption would remain the same, isn't it?
Yes, sir. It will show up under the shares. So it is nothing but one of the share that we're looking at, just that the location is different. That's it.
Absolutely. Good. Thanks. Back to you.
All right. So so the next one is from a risk exposure perspective. So risk is anything that is non-conformance to requirements, or people accessing it, or users unknowingly using something. So there might not be any malicious intent from the user. It is just the way it is being configured, and that is posing the risk to the organization. So how can you look at it? Now here, I'm looking at the users there. So there are multiple users. So I can go here and I see that there are 109 users. So I can filter it out to a certain domain and so on. So I can look at the information. So there is a lot more that you can do here, but I'm keeping up to just to the use case here. Now there is something called as a risk dossier. So here I go, the higher the number, higher is the risk, right? So I go to some users, you can see that these are all service accounts, but here there is a user with a risk score of 81. So how does a risk score come into picture? A risk score is determined using this functionality. So at the top, you will notice that there are 3 different aspects. So what is the access rights that are being provided? What are the anomalies? And is there any alert against this user? So that make up the risk score. So here, what this is saying is just with the access rights have not been set properly. So for those reasons, so the risk score is 81. So that's how it determines. So higher the number, higher is the risk. Right. So what we can do is, in order to get this risk-related information through, so what we'll do is we'll go back to this folder there. Now I expand it. Now I look at permissions. Now this is where it is looking at the permissions at different folders and saying that these are the permissions and overall permissions that is coming through. So that's what you're looking at. Now, how can you avoid this? Or there could be a risk here, or there might not be a risk here. If there is a risk, so what are the permissions? What is the control list that you are saying? And finally, what you also see is something called as recommendations. Now, this is a good thing, and this is what Data Insight has looked at, assessed the information, and said that, oh, these are the rights that are not required, or these are the rights that would better give a good security posture, right? So whatever access or permissions that you're provided today is not right. Rather, can you change it to this? this kind of functionality, and you can apply those changes. So right now I haven't set the permissions. So if you go to settings, you can set the permissions as well. By default, it's not there. But if you enable those, you can apply these permissions. Now, obviously, you've got to assess from various different aspects. Now, based on the typical scan in an environment, it is seeing the overall picture and saying that this is adding to the risk. And how can you reduce that risk is by doing these changes, which you can do it manually on those file shares by going and doing it, or asking appropriate teams to assess those. Or if you want to do it from Data Insight, you can do those as well. Right? So a very, very good way to identify and assess the risk on your data landscape, file landscape. So how are people utilizing it? And who are the users who are doing it? Does it pose a potential risk? And if it is, how can you avoid those risks? Right?
And Ranga, on
for a moment.
Yeah, thanks for the pause, Ranga. I'm looking at the recommendations, and the recommendations clearly call out that we need to revoke access. But the beauty of this is it actually gives you a reason of why things, the access should be revoked. And if you see, it says these users are being inactive. Now, if I just blow that up a little bit, and based on my experience, and of course, the forum here, I've seen it multiple times. But based on my experience, if there is a ransomware or a utility that is eventually going to create damage or corruption in the environment, the target is such inactive users, which give the program the unnoticed entry. Now, if something like that happens, and if there is a vulnerability which keeps access, like for example, the Max Jones here, or even the other user has full access onto this share, and if at all somebody impersonates into this as this user, it might just go unnoticed. And that's a potential risk. And the other way of finding it out, and maybe I'm going back into your risk profile view, Ranga, is if something like this happens, you can identify from this recommendation, but then you can also go and look at the folder activity or an activity pattern where you had the timeline, which says from January to June, there was absolutely no activity, and suddenly this user has started to show activity, and that's why we've highlighted that as a risk. So there are two or multiple ways to identify if there is an undesirable or an unexpected event happening underneath in the whole data set. Make sense?
Right. That's right. And also, look, just not the folder activity, you can also look from a user activity. Which user is accessing more? Now, somebody might have impersonated, as you said, and they're bombarding this information. So maybe that's a cause of ransomware as well. So somebody is coming in as an impersonation and accessing it, trying to do something or look at the data and so on.
Brilliant.
Any questions in the meantime?
Let me check. Rob, any questions so far?
We seem to be all up to date with the questions. I guess just one thing just to probably add, just where you were there, Ranga, was just around the control points. So Data Insight has the ability to demonstrate where you've got any kind of deviations in permissions that are being inherited or not inherited. These are really good to be able to identify where there may have been a potential breach or a potential change by, like, say, a help desk or things like that. So it's really good to be able to identify some of these. I've seen a lot of examples where organisations have gone through these kind of remediation exercises to identify where these permissions have changed in their file systems over many years, and what we've been able to do is help those customers identify where we can, look at finding all these, and like being able to report on them, and then be able to then remediate those permission changes as well. So it's quite critical from a few different areas from a security side as well.
Absolutely. So people set it, forget it in many cases, and they don't revisit it, and that causes potential issues down the line.
Ranga, there are a couple of there are a couple of questions that relate to this risk profile, and I think it's a good discussion point. Now, the first question is curious to know how antivirus malware software like Trend or any other software reacts with Data Insight. Does it see it as a safe process? I'm going to take a stab at it. Yes, Data Insight being a process that runs on the management console, yes, it will be a safe process. But it's a very good segue into another extension point of Data Insight. Now, coexisting with antivirus is one aspect, but collaborating with the antivirus or even data leakage prevention or loss prevention softwares, DLPs, is another aspect where Data Insight does a wonderful job. Now, Data Insight has a tight correlation with Symantec DLP, and you can actually have product integration with policies working hand in hand. So that's again an extension. I'm sure it's out of scope for today's demo, but if you have areas that you want to explore with Data Insight and collaboration with Symantec DLP, reach out to us. We'll be happy to walk you through that. Back to you, Ranga.
Okay, so the third use case that I would want to highlight here is compliance. Now, compliance has become a key aspect for many enterprises, many organizations. Now, they come under the gamut of certain regulatory requirements. It could be within a council, within a government organization, within a private organization like banking or healthcare, or they come under a global purview where they are monitored by multiple regulators like GDPR, or it could be HIPAA and so on. Now, in these cases, what do you do? So how do you evaluate those risks, and how do you identify those? So right now you're seeing the risk there. So there are multiple, so it says that there are sensitive files, there are certain active files, so there are active users on a certain set of folders and so on. You can see it straight away. So it gives you those information there. So obviously a user with a high risk score could be a catastrophic incident for that organization. So again, as I said, the user might unintentionally be doing it, but you see it as a risk through this functionality. What are they up to? What are they doing? Is the practices right or not? Okay, so what you can do is you can now bring it under a specific compliance functionality. And how do you do that is going through something called as classification. So you see that there is Veritas Information Classifier. This is a microservice that comes integrated with multiple products, and Data Insight is one of them. Now, you see that there are 50 plus policies that are already there. There are many patterns and tags that are predefined. That doesn't stop you from importing something new where I'm pointing to, or you can create. You could come under a combination of these policies for a specific sector, so you could create your own policy. Now, what I've done is so all of these would be disabled by default. Now, you can search for those as well. For example, I can say Australia, and now it shows all the policies relevant to Australian environment. Now, or you can create your own, as I said. I have got multiple regulations here, so I have enabled only one just to find out. I have pre-run this because it does take time against the amount of data that you're trying to run. So for instance, I'm looking at US Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Now, what this act does, so it defines certain conditions, what it should look like and how long you want to retain this information. So there is these search requirements there that has already been set up. Now, if you want to look at any file, so I can browse to a certain file, select a particular file, and see if there are any values there. So, for instance, I can say that now it is saying that this file does contain some information relevant to HIPAA. So it is basically validating the conditions now, which means that we index those data. So we have reference points there and we look at the data. So this is looking at one file. Now, how can I classify it against a certain set of values there? So I have enabled this particular policy. All I need to do is go back to my workspace and then look at the shares. So I've got multiple shares. Now I've got medical, I've got general. Now there are two sensitive files that have got this. So here is a tag there, and the tag has been applied. So the reason is all I did was I went and I clicked on classify. So the moment I click on classify, any selection that I do, so what happens here is the classification requests are done. So it has scanned about 5 files. It has indexed that information, and it took certain time, about 3 minutes, to look at each of those files, validate against that policy condition or the tags that have been defined, and then it has looked at that info and said that, look, there are 2 files that match this criteria. Now, how can I do that is, now if I go to general, so it says, we've got 5 files here in general, and it is giving all the important information. Now I can say that, hey, let's look at the classification. Does any files come under the classification? There are 2 files that match this criteria. So this is classification. Now, why do I need this classification? Because of compliance requirements, regulatory requirements. So here it says that if you have any content relevant to this particular policy, then you need to retain it for 20 years or 30 years. Or if you have got a patient record, you want to retain it for 100 years. Depends, right? So if it's an academic thing, for a school, you could retain it for forever or until they turn 70 years, something like that. Now, whenever there is a policy requirement and you have huge load of files and folders that you need to look at, obviously, looking at each file is not possible, and there are many people who have got different accesses to those files. So what Data Insight can help you is achieve this classification, look for certain tags, help you to classify, and they run as a job, and they classify, and then you can look at the files. Now you can take actions against them. So what can you do with these particular files? So how can you what can you do with these files? Or do you want to archive them? Do you want to send it to a low-tier storage, maybe to a cloud? So it depends. So now you can choose those files and say, oh, these are sensitive. The rest, they have hit the gate, so they could be deleted. We don't need those files because nobody is touching these files, or nobody has touched these files in the last 5 years or 10 years. So what can we do about it? Get rid of those files or move it to another storage. So these are the decision-making, the help that you get in this making informed decisions is where Data Insight excels. Now, on top of it, as I said, there is a whole lot of reports. So one of the questions that came about, so I haven't forgotten that question yet. So one of the questions that came about was, oh, if there is ransomware, what can you do to help me alert those? So your activity details for paths, activity details for users or groups, or it could be for files. So here, these are the auditing things. Now we can schedule them to run at a specific time, and then they send it as an alert. And alert settings can be achieved here. It could be SMTP or SNMP settings. So you can do both, and they could send you those information, or you could generate these reports there. Now, one last thing I want to touch, noting that there is we have 15 minutes to the hour. So I'll quickly go into this detail here. So the next thing is what actions you want to take. So I can do something called as archiving. So I can select a particular folder or a set of files and say, archive this information. So who to archive this? Obviously, Data Insight works with Enterprise Vault. So it's an archiving software, a very well-known archiving software. So it can help you to archive it to tertiary storage, some low-cost tier storage, so that you don't have to retain it on your very expensive storage. So what you do is identify your, so there is remediation here. So under data management, you can add your file mapping services. And finally, what you could do is you can start archiving. Oh, I have found these files that haven't been touched for X amount of time, or based on this report, these data is simply sitting there doing nothing for X amount of time. So what we do is let's archive this data. Okay, there are the valid reasons, and you can provide those valid reasons. All right, so I will stop there in terms of the demo itself, but I would want to show you certain other aspects to it. Give me one moment. Let me go through. All right. Now, what we also do is for enterprises, we help them to identify these, or whether they're compliant, or what sort of data is there, what are the unknowns, where is the risk. So we provide this whole information through an exercise called as dark data assessment. Now, this dark data assessment can be done through the partners, or you can do it. You can go through us, and we can help you to achieve this assessment there. Let me give you the reports. Now, this report is very extensive, so you can ask for certain requirements, whether you just want to know what is the posture of my data environment here. So I've got terabytes of data. Mind you, I've done multiple assessments like these in the past, and what we have encountered is, don't be baffled, about 80% of the data that we see are predominantly old. When I say old, 4+ years, 8+ years, they're there because nobody knows what this is doing, who is accessing this information. Yes, they know the permissions, all good. There is only active users, blah, blah, blah. But they don't know who has access when. When was the last successful access? And they've been backing up this data for ages, increasing their backup storage as well, and doing nothing there. So what we do is, with this assessment, we provide you a very good insight into how you're progressing, how is your environment, what are you doing with this, how is your storage, what are the folders, what percentage of the data that you have, how much of that do you know about? See that? So this is true. In one such environment, I did about 6 terabytes of dark data assessment. About 4.8 terabytes of data turned out to be stale, really, really old. A lot of access databases, PST files, very old files that have been retained, and multiple duplicates, many duplicate files that have been retained in multiple locations. So we look at this and say, oh, this is the amount of data that you have, and this is how the data aging is. See that? We definitely find files which is 7+ years old residing on your very good storage, which you don't need. Rather, if you feel that is important, move it to a low-tier storage. And again, do you want to move everything, or do you want to classify them? Only keep what is relevant to your businesses, and anything else you can get rid of it. Make space. So is it there? So very large files. How much do you say? Duplicate files. This is under concern with a lot of companies. So sensitive data. This is through compliance. Is it the right files to have? Classified data based on certain classification policies, tagging. We identify how many files are there. What are those files? What are the file paths? We look at it. Now, all you're seeing is there is an integration through Power BI Desktop, which means we are looking at all these data there. Now, we can look for risk or ransomware. So what are the ransomware files? So it has the ability to look at it, all the audit logs. So we provide you these kind of reporting over a period of time. And this doesn't take too much of time. So all we need is about a week's time to come and look at it and give you a very good report. So please engage us. So I'll hand it over to Pat again. At the end of this slide session, so you'll see email. So by all means, feel free to write to us. And if you want to engage us, let us know, and we'll be happy to do it. Over to you, Amit and Pat.
Right, Pat, if you take the last few slides, and I have a couple of interesting questions, considering we've got about 11 minutes. I think we can discuss a few of those good questions on air.
No, great, thanks. Now, the one thing I wanted to add also, with Data Insight is that, with the reporting capabilities within Data Insight, you can also perform actionable events. So you could run a report that would capture, let's say, log files, and then perform a deletion, right? So that's one thing that Data Insight can also do that probably you didn't see in the demo, but our reporting capabilities can do just more than just reporting. It can actually provide those insights and those actions. So Data Insight can also integrate with other solutions. So Ranga kind of briefly demonstrated that we can also integrate Data Insight into Enterprise Vault. Right, so therefore we can determine sort of the age, the owner, which server, what shares, and the behaviour of that data. And as mentioned, if you find that you've got information that you've classified and you need to retain, you can easily sort of use the integration between Data Insight and Enterprise Vault to archive that content, to then apply the right retention schedule. You can apply any tags from a supervision or classification perspective, and you can even apply legal hold. I did see a question sort of, in the Q&A around applying legal hold. So for information that's sitting in Data Insight, you can use Data Insight to lock those files. So apply a legal hold within Data Insight, but you can also archive that content with integration of EV and apply legal hold. Then, from that, we've got our e-discovery platform. So our e-discovery platform can then perform the high-level e-discovery capabilities of your data that you've identified and you've archived into Enterprise Vault, and provide you the ability to provide semantic analysis. We've got predictive coding applied to easily identify information that's required in an e-discovery. So if you in the event that you've got some legal action, you can use the combination of these solutions to actually provide the right information at the right time and reducing your legal expense. Now, as a takeaway, we've got our risk analyzer. So our risk analyzer is a web page that you can go through, and you can actually give our classification engine a test drive. Right, we've got some predefined classifications set that will actually allow you to demonstrate this engine. So it's quite simple. You provide a sample of your data. It will actually go through, perform the classification, give you a nice little report, and then delete that data. Right. So here's something to know. So it's a good idea to have a play around, especially if you're looking for PII information. You can use this to identify that data. Now, I guess if you have no more questions, please feel free to contact us via our email address, anz.team@veritas.com, or contact your local account manager or SE. Now, I guess we've still got 7 minutes, so I guess a good time for any further questions.
Thanks, Pat. Yes, as we go through, there is one interesting question coming in around using the capability of Data Insight in context of honeypots. Now, this is a very interesting concept that organizations use. And the question, let me read out the question first before I dig further into the answer, is for compliance reason, we might not be able to view users' unstructured data. So do we have the ability to set traps or honeypots that have the ability to simulate a user and their data, where we could monitor continuously and set alarms? So the short answer is yes, absolutely. And the way Data Insight allows you is to create such content, which is a dummy or a honeypot, if you'd like to say, and then set triggers on it. Now, there are multiple triggers that we can actually look for. One trigger is data activity trigger. Now, that means that it defines what is the access count, or you can define a threshold on the access count on a particular data path. And based on that, it will start generating alerts if that particular threshold is met. We can also do it the other way around. The first one was around the data. The second one is around the user activity. So you can actually then look at per user access, how the whole thing maps into it. And if there is any deviation from the expected user activity for that particular group, is when you can start raising alerts. There is an ability to do whitelisting as well. Now that's the flexibility that the policies can give you, and then we can turn around into whichever fits best from your exercise. Rob, Ranga, Pat, did you want to add any additional points here?
Yeah, one thing I want to add is Data Insight scans the metadata of your files, right? So we're not actually sort of got access to actually view that information. So all we do is we scan that metadata. The classification engine will actually go in and open those files and look for the keywords or the original expressions to find that data. But Data Insight doesn't have access to that information, right? So an administrator can't go in and open those files and view them, right? Now I saw another question around, do we need to deploy an agent? So with Data Insight, we can, scan the information without deploying an agent, but what we don't do is we won't capture that access event. So by deploying an agent, we'll be able to capture all the access event information. So the access of files, the reading, the writing, the deletion.
Absolutely, that's great. And I think I'm going to take that one step further. And there's a good question around, how does the solution help with Australian-based compliance and the APRA 6 and the other compliance? How does that fit in? Pat, did you want to talk about the classification policies?
Yeah, most definitely. So with the APRA regulations are there designed to provide guidance around information lifecycle. And this is the biggest challenge that I've seen with a lot of organizations is that how long do I need to keep that data, right? And then it's like, what is it? So with the classification policies, we can help you identify, what that information is. So if you've got, financial information that's stored in, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, PDF files, we can help then identify, the classification, sort of based on the requirement you need to meet. So if it's an APRA regulation or if it's some form of financial regulation. So let's say I need to keep files that contain financial information, and I need to keep that for 7 years. You can then use Data Insight to classify that data. Once you've classified and identified it, then you could then look at tiering that off to a different storage, or if you've got Enterprise Vault, archive that into an archive, sitting on low-cost storage. It's indexed, so therefore it's searchable and allows you to perform e-discovery. And most importantly, you can then assign the correct retention. In my experience, I've worked in the archiving space for a long time, and I've come across a lot of organisations that have all this dark data. They archive it and then they keep it forever, right? So nowadays, we can now help define that data and actually apply those right retentions.
That's right. Thanks, Pat. Given that we are almost at the top of the hour, I would like you all to remind that thank you all for the questions. We will make sure that we answer all the questions. If they're not answered until now, we will get back to you straight up after this session. Feel free, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us on our email address. And the best question will get a $50 JB Hi-Fi voucher. Trudy will reach out to the winner later during today or tomorrow. And until next time, I think we've got it covered. Until next time, stay safe, stay home for people in Victoria, and we will see you in another Tech Drop-In session in about 2 weeks from now. Trudy, back to you.